Before Mr. Chaffin could say more, the rector himself appeared, having been alerted by the unusual drift of children toward the vestry end of the church. Canon Linstead moved with the mild agitation of a man whose authority was rarely challenged, but frequently inconvenienced. His cassock swayed behind him with ceremonial dignity, an effect somewhat diminished by the woolen scarf wound around his neck in rebellion against the church's chronic chill. "What's all this?" he asked, peering down at Edwin with benevolent suspicion. Edwin repeated his statement, slightly more nervous this time under the rector's gaze, but no less insistent. The mention of a package caused Canon Linstead to frown, not from fear, but from a clerical instinct that anything unexpected would eventually lead to a committee meeting. "Well, Mr. Chaffin," he said, "perhaps we should have a look." The choirmaster, inwardly longing for the quiet of his bicycle ride home, nevertheless nodded with martyr-like acceptance. He motioned for Edwin to lead the way, though the boy's slow, careful steps showed that his confidence had waned somewhat in the shadowy aisle. The vestry corridor was dimly lit by a single bulb whose flickering suggested imminent retirement. The air smelt faintly of candle wax and the older choirboy's aftershave experiments. Edwin pointed toward the radiator, a tall, cast-iron affair that emitted more noise than heat. "There," he whispered. They leaned in. The space behind the radiator was empty save for a slight dust smudge, no package, not even an impression of one. Mr. Chaffin straightened with the weary patience reserved for small boys and their overstimulated imaginations. "You see, Edwin, nothing there at all." "But it was," Edwin murmured, cheeks warming. "I saw someone bend down and tuck it behind." Canon Linstead offered a kind smile intended to settle the matter. "Perhaps a trick of the light, my boy. These old buildings can play odd games with shadows." Edwin said nothing. His hands folded stubbornly before him, an expression his mother often interpreted as the first stage of immovable certainty. The rector and choirmaster exchanged one of those subtle glances shared by adults who agreed that a child's dramatic instincts were best cured by a brisk walk home and a firm bedtime. Still, the rector tested the nearby doors to reassure everyone. The vestry was locked, the robing room was empty, the choir loft held nothing but stacked sheet music and a solitary umbrella whose owner perpetually forgot it existed. "All quite harmless," Canon Linstead said. "Now let's finish up and allow everyone to go home before Mr. Chaffin mutinies." This produced a thin smile from the choirmaster, but failed to soften Edwin's evident concern. His eyes lingered on the radiator long after the others had turned away, as though expecting it to confess something under pressure. The rehearsal ended shortly afterward, the choirboys scattering into the night like small, chattering sparks. Edwin walked home with his elder sister, who dismissed his story with the airy confidence of someone 2 years older, and therefore certain she understood the world perfectly. It was only the next morning when the church caretaker, Mr. Sennett, arrived to unlock the vestry that a faint unease crept into the building's routine. The radiator corridor, freshly swept the previous afternoon, now bore a trail of faint scuff marks as though someone had dragged something small but weighty along the tiles. And there was, unmistakably, a lingering scent of lavender polish, the kind kept in the ladies' robing room and used sparingly, as Canon Linstead frequently reminded the committee, due to its extravagant price. Mr. Sennett frowned. He bent, sniffed, straightened, then sniffed again like a terrier, doubting its own instincts. He muttered. "That wasn't there last night." He mentioned it to no one, partly because he disliked unnecessary conversation and partly because he felt the rector was already burdened with excessive information. Instead, He simply filed it away among the many small peculiarities he attributed to church life: unexplained drafts, disappearing candles, and the occasional choir mother convinced the organ blower was possessed. Yet, later that afternoon, while delivering the weekly rota sheet to the police station, he mentioned it in passing to Sergeant Malley, more as a curiosity than anything demanding constabulary attention. Malley, who had a well-developed appetite for harmless mysteries, listened with growing interest. Scuff marks, a smell of lavender, a choirboy claiming midnight mischief. He felt an agreeable tingle of possibility, the kind that brightened an otherwise dull Thursday. "Best mention it to Inspector Purbright," he said, folding the rota and sliding it aside. "He likes to know when the town starts behaving unusually." Sennett raised an eyebrow. "This hardly qualifies, surely?" "You'd be surprised what qualifies," Malley replied. Inspector Purbright, when informed, showed no excitement whatsoever. His reaction consisted of a quiet, "I see," followed by a thoughtful pause and the faint narrowing of one eye, a micro-expression that Malley had learned to interpret as significant interest, even if Purbright would never admit it. "Perhaps I'll stroll by the church later," Purbright murmured. "Just to satisfy curiosity." Malley leaned forward. "You think the lad really saw something?" Purbright considered the question with the unhurried calm of a man who preferred to let facts ferment. "Children," he said gently, "are often wrong in what they assume, but they are rarely wrong in what they notice." It was a comment Malley decided to ponder later when he had less paperwork and more tea. As evening settled over Flaxborough, with its dim shop windows and comforting aroma of chips drifting from the high street, Purbright made his way to St. Ethelred's. He carried no notebook, no urgency, only the quiet, attentive presence that the townspeople found strangely reassuring. He paused at the vestry corridor, running a finger lightly along the tiles. Yes, there were marks, faint, irregular, like something dragged in haste. And the lavender polish, though barely detectable, lingered like a half-forgotten memory. Purbright rested his hands behind his back. "Well now," he murmured to the empty air, "what persuaded someone to borrow the vestry at such an hour?" The church, dignified and silent, offered no reply. But Purbright's interest, gentle though it appeared, had quietly and firmly taken root. By the following morning, the matter, if it could yet be called a matter, had trickled politely through the veins of Flaxborough society, picking up decoration and distortion with every retelling. What began as Edwin thought he saw someone in the vestry corridor became, through the town's natural conversational metabolism, a suspicious intruder with a wrapped object creeping about the church after hours. Mrs. Cladwell, whose principal hobbies were knitting and small-scale panic, was the first to escalate the situation with any real flair. Over her morning tea at the railway buffet, she informed an audience composed mostly of commuters and a drowsy station cat that there had been a figure, hooded, lurking by the holy vessels. Her dramatic pause suggested that holy vessels were particularly tempting targets for wrongdoers. This version travelled swiftly. By the time Inspector Purbright entered the same buffet half an hour later, a stout man in tweed was telling the station master that thieves were removing candlesticks, one piece at a time, very systematically. When Purbright passed behind him to reach the tea urn, he heard the man conclude, with gloomy satisfaction, "Organised crime, that's what this is. The church has been asking for it, leaving valuable icons everywhere." Purbright's polite nod sufficed as acknowledgement, though privately he doubted that any organised criminal syndicate had chosen St. Ethelred's as its opening move. Across town, the gossip gained a different seasoning. The Mothers' Union held their Thursday committee meeting in the vicarage parlour, where 13 women of varying temperaments fortified themselves with sponge cake, before discussing matters of church maintenance, missionary funding, and edible seating arrangements for the harvest supper. No sooner had the meeting begun than Mrs. Vellum, who often claimed unique insight into spiritual disturbances, leaned forward with a lowered voice. "My neighbour's cousin knows for a fact that something was left as a sign, a sort of ritual offering. You know, the sort of thing people do when influenced by modern ideas." The phrase "modern ideas" descended over the table like an omen. Several committee members exchanged alarmed looks. Mrs. Fanshawe immediately reached for the Victoria sponge, as if sugar might protect her. "Well," said Mrs. Timbleby, "it wouldn't surprise me. Rituals are everywhere these days. I read something in the County Chronicle about teenagers lighting candles in fields." "Praying?" someone asked hopefully. No, not praying." Mrs. Timbleby shuddered meaningfully. "Arranging things." A murmur of righteous unease spread through the room. Canon Linstead's wife, who had been praying for an uneventful meeting, closed her eyes briefly and wondered whether she should warn her husband that a crisis of civic morality was about to land in his lap. By midday, the speculation had reached the high street. In Fuller's butcher shop, the assistant told a delighted customer that the police had already discovered a trail, which the customer later interpreted to mean footprints, bloodstains, or perhaps sacred symbols. Fuller himself, who prided his establishment on resisting gossip, nevertheless listened with a pleasurable twitch of the eyebrow. Next door, at Pratt's stationery, Mr. Pratt was explaining that vandals had probably stolen the church's offertory envelopes. "You can't trust people," he said, with an air of authority. "Anything lying around these days gets pinched. Only last month I lost a box of blue biros." The postmistress, passing by the open door, interjected, "I believe it's something to do with hymnals. That's what Mrs. Snelling said anyway. Someone said they heard someone say that one had been taken." Her certainty, though based on nothing firmer than conversation, added a comfortable sense of detail to the rumour. Across the square, the Green Man public house offered yet another angle. By early afternoon, the regulars had reached a consensus that something of clandestine importance had been hidden in the church. Mr. Creek, who enjoyed presenting himself as a man familiar with the shadows of life, declared, "Could be documents. People hide things in radiators in spy films." The landlord, polishing glasses behind the bar, asked, "What sort of documents would anyone hide in St. Ethelred's?" "Secret ones," Creek replied confidently. "That's why they hid them." This answer, though circular, satisfied the pub's demand for intrigue. Several men nodded with a sense of shared witness to the encroaching tide of international espionage. Meanwhile, across town in a quieter corner, Edwin Loft found himself the centre of slightly unwelcome attention at his school. He was approached by 3 classmates during morning break, each wide-eyed with varying degrees of admiration and skepticism. "Did you really see someone?" asked Colin, who favoured dramatic stories. "Yes," Edwin replied, trying to appear calm, though he enjoyed the attention more than he would admit. "What did they look like?" demanded Jimbo, who considered himself an authority on criminal behaviour due to his extensive reading of detective comics. "I don't know, just a shape." Jimbo looked disappointed. "That's not very helpful." "They left something," Colin added eagerly. "What was it?" "I don't know," Edwin said again, voice quieting. "It was wrapped. Then it disappeared." This only heightened the intrigue. Children who delight in mysteries regardless of plausibility followed him around for half the day, hoping for further revelations. Edwin, though somewhat overwhelmed, also felt a prickling satisfaction that he had been right after all, that something truly odd had occurred. Back at the police station, Sergeant Malley continued to receive fragments of the town's increasingly embroidered account. A woman delivering a lost dog report paused to say, "You know, I heard it was a bag of money. Someone found it and whisked it off before the choirboy could speak up." Another man insisted that smugglers had probably used the church as a drop-off point. Mally made no comment, but each claim added to his private amusement. When Purbright returned from his quiet visit to the church earlier, he found a neat pile of notes Mally had collected. At the top, in Mally's handwriting, were the words, "Public speculation, becoming lively." No evidence for any of it. Purbright sifted the comments with mild interest. His expression remained neutral, though the corner of his mouth threatened at one point to rise in amusement. "People do enjoy a puzzle," Mally remarked. "Yes," Purbright replied, setting the papers down, "particularly those where they can supply most of the pieces themselves." "And the lavender scent you mentioned, sir?" Purbright glanced toward the window where the faint hum of afternoon traffic drifted through the glass. "A curiosity," he said. "Not yet a concern. Yet people are talking like something dreadful happened." "People often start with a conclusion," Purbright said gently, "and then work backwards in search of evidence." Mally nodded, though a thought lingered. "Do you suppose the boy was telling the truth?" Purbright let a pause settle into the room, as though giving the air itself a moment to think. "I believe," he said at last, "that something occurred. What exactly remains to be found." Outside, the slow rhythm of Flaxborough life continued, shop doors opening and closing, bicycles rattling down cobbled lanes, the post office bell chiming softly with each customer's arrival. But within those ordinary patterns, small murmurs persisted, threads of curiosity that would soon tug quite insistently at the quiet fabric of the town. Purbright sensed it, not urgency, but the faint beginning of a shape. Something unseen yet quietly present. And though he showed no hurry, he had already begun, in his usual unassuming way, to follow where the threads might lead. Inspector Purbright began his morning circuit with the same unhurried steadiness that distinguished all his inquiries, whether they concerned missing livestock, misaddressed parcels, or, on rare occasions, genuine crime. Yet beneath his calm surface lived a keen, quiet curiosity that rarely missed a shift of tone or a poorly chosen detail. Today, the matter of Edwin Loft and the vanishing package accompanied him like a faint, persistent melody. His first stop was St. Ethelred's, where the morning light filtered through the nave windows in muted colours, illuminating particles of dust that drifted like lazy confetti. The church caretaker, Mr. Sennett, was already at work, polishing brass with the grim determination of a man who believed cleanliness directly correlated with spiritual well-being. Purbright greeted him with a warm nod. "Busy as ever, Mr. Sennett?" "Always something needs doing," Sennett replied, rubbing a candlestick with renewed fervour. "People don't realize how much fuss a church makes." Purbright examined the corridor again. In daylight, the scuff marks appeared more distinctly, thin, shallow lines that broke and reappeared, as though the object had been lifted halfway, then dragged anew. He noted the faint lavender scent still lingering in the air, though now diluted by draughts drifting through the old stonework. "You mentioned yesterday that the scent was unusual," Purbright said. "Very," Sennett replied. "I only use it in the ladies' robing room. That's the posh polish. Nothing else around here would smell like it." "Were the robing room doors locked last night?" "They were when I left," Sennett said, his tone edging toward defensive pride. "But I can't answer for anyone after rehearsal." Purbright thanked him and moved toward the vestry. Its orderly interior suggested nothing more sinister than mild neglect. A rack of albs hung like ghostly laundry, A stack of hymnals lay askew, as though someone had rummaged through them in haste, though this might equally have been the handiwork of choristers. As he exited, he encountered the rector striding across the churchyard with purposeful steps that hinted at overnight contemplation. "Inspector," Canon Linstead said, adjusting his scarf with clerical dignity, "I hope you're not being troubled by all this silly talk." "Silly talk has its uses," Purbright replied amicably. "It often points to something underneath." Linstead sighed, the sound of a man who both valued peace and doubted he would get any for several days. Children imagine things, especially at rehearsals. Late nights, dim corridors, and far too much excitement. "Possibly," Purbright murmured. "Still, I'd like to hear your recollection of last night." The rector recounted the events patiently. The rehearsal, dragging on, Edwin's interruption, the inspection of the corridor, the absence of any package. Purbright listened politely, storing the small hesitations, the faint delay before mentioning the locked vestry, the slight emphasis on Edwin's imagination. "I suppose," Linstead concluded, "it's all been blown into extraordinary proportion." "Flaxborough enjoys a story," Purbright said lightly, "but sometimes the stories choose their own direction." The rector looked vaguely unsettled, as though uncertain whether the inspector's comment was reassuring or ominous. Purbright thanked him and continued his quiet circuit. His next visit was to the Loft household. Edwin's mother opened the door with a flurry of concern, ushering Purbright inside before he could finish his greeting. The house smelled of breakfast toast and lemon polish, an ordinary domestic scent that contrasted sharply with the lavender at St. Ethelred's. "I do hope Edwin hasn't caused trouble," she said at once. "He takes things so seriously, terribly earnest." Purbright gave her a gentle smile. "Earnestness is no fault, Mrs. Loft. May I speak with him?" Edwin sat at the kitchen table, swinging his legs with subdued energy. He looked simultaneously proud and anxious, as though unsure whether his experience would be believed. Purbright took a seat opposite him. "Edwin, you mentioned you saw someone last night. I'd like you to tell me exactly what you saw. Nothing added, nothing removed." Edwin took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I went to fetch my water bottle. The corridor was dark, but I saw someone bending down by the radiator. They had something in their hands, wrapped in paper or cloth. They tucked it behind the radiator. When I stepped closer, they moved away. I think they went toward the back door." "Could you see their face?" "No, just that they weren't small, not like a boy." "Tall?" "Not tall like you," Edwin said thoughtfully. "More like Mr. Chaffin's height, or the organist." Purbright nodded. "Did they make any sound? Or say anything?" "No, sir. Only footsteps, trying to be quiet." "And the package? Did you see any colour, shape? It was small, like a lunch parcel." Purbright offered a soft nod of thanks. Edwin relaxed a fraction, clearly relieved to have expressed his story without ridicule. Before leaving, Purbright spoke briefly with Edwin's mother, who explained that her son was not prone to fantasies. Dreamy, perhaps, but not dishonest. Purbright left with the sense that Edwin had indeed observed something, though what that something meant remained misted in uncertainty. His next call took him to the choirmaster, Mr. Chaffin, who lived in a modest terraced house decorated with framed concert posters from more ambitious musical years. Chaffin greeted him with the exaggerated fatigue of a man whose life had been complicated by someone else's imagination. "It was late," Chaffin said, gesturing Purbright inside. "The boys get restless, Edwin especially. He thinks every shadow is an omen." "Yet shadows often indicate something blocking the light," Purbright replied mildly. "Did you see anyone in that corridor?" "No, but I did hear someone pass by the organ loft earlier.
I assumed it was Mrs. Penrith, the organist. She comes and goes in her own fashion. Was she present all evening? Chaffin paused too long. She said she was. I didn't check. Purbright tucked this away. And the rehearsal? A shambles, Chaffin said. The altos were flat, the tenors were absent in spirit if not in body, and the sopranos were conducting private conversations in the key of gossip. Anyone slip away unnoticed? Several, they always do. The boys visit the lavatory in pairs, claiming deep biological necessity. I don't supervise closely. Purbright thanked him and listened as Chaffin launched into a lament about the decline of church music in general. Yet amid the theatrics a detail glinted, the mention of Mrs. Penrith, whose comings and goings had apparently become sufficiently unpredictable to excuse a footstep. Purbright left Chaffin's residence and crossed the square toward the organist's cottage. Mrs. Penrith was a stern, hawk-eyed woman whose affection for the organ pipes bordered on possessiveness. She answered the door with a look suggesting that any unexpected caller must naturally be bringing her bad news. "I wasn't anywhere near your mysterious radiator," she said, before he had finished explaining his visit. "I left early, the choir was hopeless, and Mr. Chaffin's timing was abysmal." "You weren't present for the end of rehearsal?" Purbright asked. "I told him I was stepping out for air. I don't believe in making dramatic exits." "And did you return?" "I did not. I walked home. Ridiculous business, all of it." Purbright inclined his head. "You didn't happen to pass anyone outside the church?" She hesitated. Not long enough for suspicion, but long enough to reveal calculation. "Only that fellow Dunn, the treasurer." He seemed flustered. "But he's always flustered. It's his natural condition." "Did he speak to you?" "No, he shuffled off like he'd misplaced his conscience." As Purbright walked back toward the station, the threads began to weave themselves, not tightly, not yet, but enough to suggest a pattern waiting to solidify. A vanished parcel, a midnight figure, lavender polish, a nervous treasurer, an organist with selective presence, a choirmaster with blind spots. Nothing conclusive, yet enough to justify the slightest quickening of his thoughts. And though Purbright displayed no outward haste, the morning circuit had given shape to a faint outline he intended, quietly and politely, to follow. Mr. Leonard Dunn, treasurer of St. Ethelred's parish council, possessed the pallor of a man who had spent too long among ledgers and too little among fresh air. His spectacles sat permanently askew, as though gravity itself sought small amusements at his expense. He lived in a narrow
house overlooking the municipal car park where he could observe, with faint resentment, the unruly habits of modern parking. Inspector Purbright arrived at Dunn's front step shortly after midday. The door opened before he could knock twice, revealing Dunn in a cardigan that seemed to have surrendered long ago to its owner's anxieties. "Oh, Inspector. Yes, of course, do come in. I thought someone might visit. People have been looking at me in the post office rather oddly." Purbright stepped into the hallway where a lingering aroma of boiled cabbage hung like a resigned tenant. Dunn ushered him into the sitting room, which held 3 competing clocks, each proclaiming a slightly different version of the present moment. "Please forgive the disorder," Dunn said, though there was little visible disorder beyond an abundance of paperwork. "The accounts are due, that is, some aspects require reconciliation." Purbright took a seat. "I understand you were at the church last night, shortly before the rehearsal ended." Dunn stiffened. "Just briefly, I was returning the offertory reports. Prefer to deliver them by hand, so they don't sit unattended." "And was that your only purpose there?" "Of course," Dunn said, though the quickness of the reply suggested he regretted speaking before considering the shape of the question. Purbright observed him with mild interest. Dunn was perspiring slightly, though the room was not warm. His fingers tapped restlessly against his knee. "You didn't see anyone in the vestry corridor?" No, well, perhaps a shadow near the back, but shadows are plentiful there. And I was in a hurry." "What caused the hurry?" Dunn blinked. "I dislike being out late." Purbright nodded gently, offering no pressure. It was enough to let Dunn navigate his own uncertainties. After a moment, Dunn added, "I may have heard footsteps now that I think on it, but I assumed it was Mrs. Penrith, or one of the boys, or perhaps the rector." "The rector was in the nave with the choirmaster." "Oh," Dunn murmured, his shoulders tightening. Purbright allowed the silence to stretch, the kind that often encouraged a guilty man to fill it with unnecessary words. Dunn did not disappoint. "You know," he said abruptly, "people are talking, saying I was lurking about. It's absurd. I have never lurked in my life." "I've heard nothing of the sort," Purbright replied calmly, though in fact he had heard precisely such suggestions whispered in the butcher's earlier. "I'm simply asking for clarity." Dunn swallowed. "Well, clarity is sometimes difficult." Purbright let that comment settle quietly. Dunn's eyes drifted toward a stack of invoices on the bureau, as though they might intervene on his behalf. "There have been rumours," Dunn continued weakly, "about some small financial discrepancies. Entirely explainable, of course. Administrative
delays, but some people seem eager to find fault." Purbright's tone remained gentle. "This is not an inquiry into financial matters, at least not at present." The phrasing caused Dunn to blink at him in mild horror. "Not at present?" Purbright rose. "Mr. Dunn, if anything else occurs to you about last night, I would appreciate hearing it." Dunn nodded with exaggerated vigour. Yes, of course. Anything at all, though I doubt there was anything of significance." As Purbright stepped into the hallway, Dunn added, almost desperately, "Inspector, you don't think you're not suggesting I had anything to do with packages or radiators?" Purbright gave him a polite, steady look. "I am suggesting nothing. I am listening." Dunn's shoulders deflated in relief, though his eyes darted anxiously beneath lowered brows. When Purbright left the house, the scent of cabbage followed him like a faint cloud, dispersing mercifully in the fresh afternoon air. He paused on the pavement, hands behind his back, and allowed himself a small sigh. Dunn's behaviour fit a familiar local pattern. When even the faintest scent of suspicion wafted near him, he reacted with such visible alarm that guilt, whether genuine or not, seemed to cling to him naturally. As Purbright walked toward the high street, Councillor Ambrose Crispin intercepted him with the enthusiastic stride of a man arriving to deliver unsolicited guidance. Crispin's fedora was at its most authoritarian angle. "Inspector, I trust you are, progressing." Purbright inclined his head. "As one does." Crispin leaned closer, lowering his voice with theatrical gravity. "I believe you ought to speak to Dunn, the treasurer, a fellow of unstable demeanour. I've long suspected he might misplace important things. I have spoken with him." Good, Crispin said, nodding too eagerly. "I trust you found him appropriately suspicious." "Suspicion is a flexible quality," Purbright replied. "It can fit many people, depending on who does the tailoring." Crispin blinked, unsure whether he was being agreed with or gently mocked. "Well, surely Dunn's nervousness tells you something. He panics at the slightest scrutiny. A man of that temperament could very well be hiding something significant." "Or something trivial," Purbright said mildly. Crispin frowned. "You're not dismissing him from your inquiry?" "I am not dismissing anything. This answer appeared to satisfy Crispin, though partly because it allowed him to believe he had contributed meaningfully. As he marched away, Purbright sensed that the councillor would soon broadcast Dunn's suspect status across the town with missionary zeal. Indeed, before the hour was out, Mally was approached by two townspeople, one whispering that Dunn had been caught red-handed, and the other claiming Dunn had confessed everything. Neither version bore resemblance to reality, but in Flaxborough, rumours quickly acquired their own skeletal structure. When Purbright returned to the station, Mally handed him a freshly scribbled note. "More talk about Mr. Dunn, sir. People seem quite convinced." Purbright read it over with faint amusement. "Convenience," he said, folding the paper neatly, "is often mistaken for evidence. Do you think he did it?" "I think he appears guilty," Purbright said quietly, with suspicious ease. "That alone makes him unlikely." Mally looked puzzled, but trusted the inspector's instincts. Purbright gazed out the window, where the slow stirrings of the town continued as though nothing unusual had occurred. Yet the faint outline of something more complex, something quietly deliberate, was beginning to emerge, and Mr. Dunn, though convenient, fit the picture rather too neatly. Inspector Purbright returned to St. Ethelred's that same afternoon, guided not by urgency but by a faint inclination, much like a man following the scent of something half-remembered. The church stood quiet, its stone walls absorbing the low murmur of distant traffic, and the damp air carried a faint, persistent echo of incense. It was here, in quiet moments, that small truths tended to loosen themselves. He stepped once more into the vestry corridor. The scuff marks remained, thin, hesitant strokes as though made by an object dragged reluctantly. Kneeling, Purbright brought his face close to the cold tiles. Nothing new appeared, yet the lines themselves felt oddly inconsistent, as though made by different pressures. He rose, brushed dust from his hands, and turned toward the radiator. A single, tiny thread of white fibre clung to the cast-iron ribs. He pinched it gently, rolling it between finger and thumb. Not wool, not cotton, something finer, smoother. The sort of fabric often used in ceremonial garments or choir robes. He slipped it into his pocket without comment. Nearby, the faint scent of lavender polish clung to the stone like a memory reluctant to fade. It was subtle, barely detectable now, but unmistakably foreign to this part of the church. Mrs. Sennett used no such polish here, and the robing rooms were a full corridor away. Someone, whether carelessly or by accident, had carried that scent with them. Purbright stood still, letting the pieces drift through his mind. A misplaced thread. Lavender, where lavender should not be. Scuff marks of something dragged, none conclusive. Yet all gently pointing toward movement, not concealment, toward something removed, rather than something left behind. He heard the faint shuffle of feet. Turning, he saw Mrs. Cramley, the formidable senior choir mother, approaching with the alert posture of a woman who considered herself the final line of defense between the choir and moral collapse. "Oh, Inspector," she said, straightening her gloves, "I didn't expect to find you lurking." She offered a smile meant to be pleasant, but edged with suspicion. "I rarely lurk," Purbright replied mildly. "I find people notice it." Mrs. Cramley gave a brittle laugh. "Well, I'm here to check on the linens. One can't rely on the junior mothers to fold things correctly. They mean well, but standards slip when one's back is turned." Purbright stepped aside as she swept into the robing room with military purpose. He followed, observing her movements with quiet attention. She opened cupboards, clicked her tongue at a cassock hung slightly crooked, and inspected the embroidery of two choir surplices with the air of a customs officer searching for contraband. "Do you keep the lavender polish here?" Purbright asked casually. Of course, she replied, tapping a small wooden chest. Canon Linstead approves its use sparingly, for festival seasons only. Anything less would be wasteful. She paused. Why do you ask? Just familiarizing myself with your materials, Purbright said. Mrs. Cramley seemed satisfied, though her expression suggested she feared the inspector might harbour radical ideas about church housekeeping. She resumed her inspection, muttering about hems and the general decay of youthful thoroughness. When she bent to lift a bundle of surplices, a faint dusting of grey flakes fell from the folds onto the floor. Coal dust? Purbright asked lightly. Oh, yes, she replied quickly. The heating system. Ghastly thing, always shedding something. But her tone wavered just for a moment. He watched her hands. They moved deftly but somewhat nervously, as though hoping the garments would reveal nothing incriminating. Nothing in her manner was openly suspicious, but the carefulness with which she handled each piece hinted at a worry she did not wish to name. Purbright left her to her task and visited the organ loft. Mrs. Penrith was absent, but the space offered its own small narrative. A stool half pulled out, sheet music slightly askew, a faint indentation on the carpet where a case or bag may have rested. He examined the fibres, just impressions, nothing more, but allowed himself a moment to picture the organist's stern face in the dim lamplight. She had denied returning last night, and yet something about this place suggested otherwise. Returning to the nave, he encountered Mr. Chaffin, who had appeared suddenly, clutching a stack of mismatched sheets. "Inspector," Chaffin said, "I've been thinking about last night, and I assure you nothing improper occurred. Choirboys exaggerate." Purbright gave a kind nod. "Just revisiting a few details." Chaffin leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You know, Dunn was very flustered, muttering to himself. He dropped a receipt near the organ and practically jumped when I handed it back." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "A receipt?" "Yes. Something about stationery, I think. He snatched it away." "Did he seem in a hurry?" "A permanent state for the poor man," Chaffin sniffed. "He is anxiety in trousers." Purbright thanked him, but as Chaffin walked off, the inspector's attention drifted back to the radiator. He touched its surface, then the wall beside it. Slight dust displacement, almost imperceptible, but present. Something had been taken away. A handbell chimed faintly in the distance as Mrs. Cramley passed through the corridor again, clutching a tin of polish. The faint lavender scent followed her like a delicate plume. And in that moment, a small realization formed, not certainty, but a direction. Lavender polish rarely travelled unnoticed. If it had appeared where it should not, then someone had moved between spaces without considering what they carried on their hands or garments, a choir robe perhaps, or the sleeve of a cassock. Purbright slipped the white fibre from his pocket once more, examining it against the light. It was a narrow thread, but threads had a way of leading somewhere. As he left the church, the afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the square. The town carried on with its typical rhythms, nothing dramatic, nothing overtly suspicious. Yet somewhere within these quiet streets lay a careful hand, someone who had moved through the sanctuary with purpose. The smallest clue, Purbright knew, often spoke loudest when everything else insisted on silence. And this particular clue, small, pale, scented faintly of lavender, had begun to speak. By the following morning, Inspector Purbright found that the town had begun to exhibit its peculiar form of collective scrutiny, where politeness and suspicion mingled like reluctant dance partners. Flaxborough had always managed to conceal small resentments beneath its genteel surface, and now those quiet frictions seemed to pulse more visibly,
stirred by the curious events at St. Ethelred's. Purbright began at the duck pond, which, he had learned, was a natural gathering point for local informants. Mr. Beckett, the bookseller, was already in place, adjusting his spectacles and watching a small family of ducks glide with clinical precision. Beckett had the air of a man who knew more about parish politics than anyone else, and he delighted in sharing just enough to maintain influence. "Morning, Inspector," Beckett said, bowing slightly. "I hear you've been investigating our little mystery. Fascinating, isn't it? Remarkable how quickly people volunteer details, even if most are exaggerated." Purbright inclined his head. "I've been following the threads, Mr. Beckett. Your perspective is appreciated." Beckett's eyes sparkled with mild cunning. "Well, you see, people in Flaxborough are extraordinarily polite. Too polite sometimes. They nod, they smile, they hide their true feelings. But it always shows in the small gestures, the glance, the hesitation, the slight overemphasis on virtue. One notices these things after a while. And have you noticed anything
unusual lately?" Purbright asked, as casually as one might inquire about the weather. Beckett's mouth twitched, as if tempted to reveal far more than he should. "Ah, the organist," he said finally. "Very precise in public, sharp with the choir. Yet I've heard a few murmurs, private, inconsequential perhaps, but enough to suggest she is less than candid about her movements. And Mr. Chaffin, poor man, easily flustered by the merest suggestion of disorder." Purbright nodded silently, noting both the content and the confidence with which Beckett delivered it. Even the most polite commentary could betray faint undercurrents if one knew where to look. Walking back toward the high street, he observed Mrs. Fanshawe and Mrs. Timbleby in animated conversation outside the baker's shop. Their discussion, at least on the surface, concerned the arrangement of pastries and the proper method of slicing bread. Yet Purbright, trained in the reading of subtle human signals, detected the slight narrowing of eyes, the brief tilt of the head, the soft exhalation. Small clues that indicated their attention had wandered far beyond breakfast. He approached Mrs. Fanshawe. "Good morning," still contemplating the correct placement of the Victoria sponge. "Oh, Inspector, you jest. But yes, one must consider proportions carefully. Though I suppose there are more pressing matters, such as the events at St. Ethelred's." "Indeed? And what do you make of them?" Purbright asked gently. Mrs. Fanshawe blinked, as though surprised at the question. "Well, people talk, naturally. But one mustn't leap to scandal. Still, I've heard whisperings about the bell-ringer, Mr. Halstead. Something about him lingering near the vestry at odd hours. I would not mention it lightly, of course, but he does have a curious way of appearing where he's not required." Purbright noted the careful phrasing. "You imply coincidence? Or intent?" "Oh, who can say?" she said, fluttering her hands. "Flaxborough's undercurrents are subtle. One must read between lines, but if one does not, why, we might all miss the small intrigues that define our little town." Across the square, Purbright observed the organist's path, moving purposefully toward the church, with that same quiet precision Beckett had mentioned. Her expression was serene, yet there was a stiffness to her shoulders, a readiness that suggested awareness of scrutiny. He made no approach, merely observed, letting the town's own rhythm inform him. By late morning, the police station was receiving an unusually steady flow of tips, each couched in civility. Mrs. Snelling had accidentally overheard the choirboys discussing mysterious noises, while Mr. Creek at the Green Man had witnessed someone moving suspiciously near the vestry, though he admitted it might have been a shadow. Each account was polite, careful, almost apologetic in tone, but together they created a lattice of
observations that could not be ignored. Purbright listened to Mally summarize the growing collection of reports. Everyone's behaving as though they're afraid of appearing rude, Mally said. It's polite, but it's chaotic. Precisely, Purbright replied. The politeness masks attention. It's the attention that interests me. By midday, he returned to St. Ethelred's to reconcile the strands he had begun collecting. Shadows fell at oblique angles across the nave, dust motes danced lazily in beams of sunlight, and the faint scent of lavender, though diminished, lingered stubbornly. The scuff marks, the displaced robes, the scattered fibres, all subtle, silent witnesses. And now, with the additional context of whispered observations, evasive movements and quiet anxieties, a faint pattern began to emerge, an invisible architecture of human behaviour built atop Flaxborough's insistence on civility. Purbright moved through the corridor with deliberate slowness, observing the subtle interactions of light and shadow, noting the precise placement of benches, and tracing the faint indentations left by hurried footsteps. Each small irregularity, once isolated, would have seemed inconsequential. Together they formed a discrete narrative of presence, intent, and, above all, human concern for appearance. By the time he left the church again, the town continued its polite bustle, unaware of the quiet scrutiny gathering in its heart. Children played in the square, shopkeepers polished displays, and the bell above St. Ethelred's rang 12 times with a dignified clang. Yet beneath the calm surface, Purbright discerned the delicate machinery of hidden motives, minor jealousies, and careful observances, the underbelly of Flaxborough's politeness, now stirring in anticipation of events yet to unfold. The following evening, Flaxborough experienced an event that subtly shattered the delicate equilibrium of speculation, sending a ripple through the town far wider than the vanished package alone had achieved. The antique processional cross, a modest yet venerable artifact kept in a locked case within St. Ethelred's, disappeared without fanfare. Its absence was discovered by the sexton early in the morning when he arrived to prepare the church for weekday services. The glass of the display case remained intact, as though nothing violent had occurred. The cross itself had simply gone, leaving only an impression of its base and a faint scent of polished wood lingering in the air. Word spread quickly, as words do in a town with a taste for measured alarm. By 9 o'clock the postmistress had informed anyone who would listen that the church had been burgled, though she allowed the qualifier in a very quiet, almost polite way. Mr. Beckett, already in his shop, muttered to a customer about the audacity of whoever had committed the theft, speculating with precise excitement that the cross had likely been removed to avoid detection during the night services. Mrs. Fanshawe passed through the square, murmuring to Mrs. Timbleby that the miscreant might be one of the choir boys, though she acknowledged it was unlikely that any child would have the nerve or the height to lift such an object. At the police station, Sergeant Mally tapped his pen impatiently on the desk, reviewing his notes while noting the increasingly embellished accounts circulating in the town. "Another disappearance," he muttered to himself. "This one's proper at least, not just a shadow or a package behind a radiator." He looked up as Purbright entered, calm as ever, carrying a folded newspaper that bore an innocuous headline masking the growing tension in the parish. "Inspector?" Mally said, gesturing toward the report. "The cross has gone, and the rumour mill is operating at full capacity. Everyone seems to have their own suspect." Purbright nodded, smoothing the paper on the desk. "And is there a pattern emerging?" "Some say Dunn did it," Mally said with a grimace. "Others insist the organist is involved. Even a few are blaming the bell ringer." "People enjoying neat conclusions," Purbright said. "Unfortunately, reality rarely obliges." They drove to the church together, Purbright seated with his usual composure, Mally nervously noting footprints and door locks along the way. Upon arrival, the sexton recounted the discovery. He had entered the nave as usual, unlocked the vestry, and found the cross missing. The case showed no sign of forced entry, though minor scratches along the wooden frame suggested that the artifact had been lifted carefully but without undue care. Purbright examined the area with patient scrutiny. The floor bore faint drag marks, remarkably similar in dimension to the scuffing noted days earlier near the radiator. He traced them slowly, following the trajectory toward the back exit of the church. Near the door, he paused to smell the air. A faint but persistent trace of lavender polish lingered again, mingling with the scent of polished wood. "Someone moved through here recently," he murmured to Mally. "With care, but not caution. They wanted the object, and yet left traces enough for observation if one cared to look." The sexton wrinkled his brow. "But who would steal the cross without breaking in?" "That is precisely the question," Purbright replied softly. Outside, the churchyard was beginning to fill with quiet observers. A few choir parents had gathered, murmuring theories that ranged from an elaborate prank to divine displeasure. Mr. Beckett arrived shortly afterward, offering conjecture that included elements of espionage and smuggling, much to the delight of those within earshot. By mid-morning, the cross was discovered floating upright in the duck pond near the town square, remarkably undamaged and slightly damp. The sexton, along with a few morally indignant citizens, fished it out with a mixture of horror and admiration. It seemed an elaborate jest, executed with both audacity and subtlety, leaving no fingerprints save those naturally accruing from handling. Purbright observed quietly, noting the reactions. The organist paused mid-step, a trace of colour rising to her cheek. Dunn appeared in the square, hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his spectacles, and Mrs. Cramley, inspecting the recovery with thinly veiled irritation, murmured about the impropriety of touching sacred objects without ceremonial gloves. "This," Purbright said to Mally under his breath, "renders the initial disappearance of the package far more credible. The pattern of behavior is now clear. Someone is demonstrating presence, not concealment, in ways meant to unsettle the town while leaving minimal evidence." Mally frowned. "Do you think it's the same person as before?" "It is plausible," Purbright said, his tone measured. "Yet the objective has shifted. The original package may have been incidental. What we now see is someone experimenting with attention, small provocations calculated to intrigue and confuse." The gathered crowd began to disperse, carrying with them a new layer of speculation, an unknown prankster, a secret rival, or perhaps someone seeking influence through subtle terror. Children chattered excitedly about daring nighttime exploits, while adults whispered in cautious tones about proper conduct, stolen treasures, and civic responsibility. Purbright lingered, hands behind his back, watching the water ripple around the recovered cross. The lavender scent, faint but unmistakable, still clung to his coat from the corridor, connecting past and present in a delicate thread. The seemingly innocent prank, now elevated by its audacity, revealed far more about the actors in Flaxborough than anyone yet realized. And in the quiet scrutiny of the inspector's eyes, the smallest details, the drag marks, the polish, the precise placement of the cross, began to whisper a subtle but unmistakable narrative, hinting at motives that would soon take shape under his careful, patient observation. By late afternoon, the small disturbances at St. Ethelred's had settled into a tenuous quiet, allowing Inspector Purbright a rare moment of uninterrupted thought. He sat in his office, hands folded behind his head, eyes not on the papers before him, but on the subtle interplay of light from the tall window, which fell across the floor in shifting patterns as if hinting at invisible connections. He considered the vanished package first, and then the audacious placement of the processional cross in the duck pond. Neither incident appeared overtly malicious, yet both had unnerved the town in ways disproportionate to the objects themselves. Flaxborough, with its preoccupation with order and civility, revealed more in its reactions than in the acts themselves. Small rivalries, Purbright noted, festered beneath the town's polite veneer. Parents who competed quietly over choir positions, committee members who measured influence by the placement of hymnals, and the organist whose stern precision concealed a streak of private amusement, all were components in an unspoken network of human behavior. Each act of attention, each minor anxiety, suggested subtle motives that were not always visible but rarely absent. He recalled Mr. Dunn's flustered movements, the organist's punctual yet selective absence, Mrs. Cramley's careful inspections, and the choirboy's earnest observation. Each individual seemed guided less by intention to commit wrong than by the desire to manage perception, to influence opinion, to control a narrative. The acts themselves, package, cross, were merely instruments for demonstrating presence, testing boundaries, or asserting unseen authority. Lavender polish, scuff marks, displaced robes, all became more meaningful when considered alongside human vanity, curiosity, and caution. Purbright mused that people often leave traces not through carelessness, but because the mind is preoccupied with social positioning. Even the most trivial action could serve a dual purpose, completing a task and communicating something subtle to observers, whether consciously or not. He thought of Edwin Loft, whose sincerity had allowed the first clue to reach him. The boy's clear perception contrasted sharply with the adult's complex web of politeness, concealing tension beneath decorum. In Flaxborough, small signals were amplified by propriety, and minor deviations could cascade into significant reactions. Purbright leaned back, considering the implications. The town's obsession with appearances, its careful management of reputation, and its polite intrigue were all catalysts in the unfolding mystery. The incidents were trivial on the surface, yet beneath them, human nature orchestrated a choreography of concealment, observation, and subtle manipulation. He pondered the patterns, why some individuals acted boldly yet left minimal evidence, while others revealed themselves through over-politeness or anxious overreaction. It was not malice that guided them, he reflected, but a complex calculus of propriety, self-interest, and the quiet desire to be perceived favorably. Even the cross in the pond, far from a simple prank, carried layers of intention. Whoever placed it there understood the town's rhythms, anticipated reactions, and leveraged civic concern for maximum effect without a single overt threat. The act spoke more of psychology than theft. It was a demonstration, subtle and precise, of influence achieved through observation of human habits. Purbright allowed himself a faint smile. The town had unwittingly provided him the narrative, each thread linking to another. Politeness, jealousy, curiosity, and vanity created a lattice upon which truth could eventually rest. It would require patience, careful questioning, and the quiet orchestration of circumstances to reveal who had moved, why, and how. He considered the next step. Observation alone would not suffice. He needed reactions, the small betrayals that occurred when one believed oneself unobserved. To do so would require a gentle touch, a question framed to unsettle without accusation, a scenario in which human nature might reveal itself in action rather than words. Purbright rose and moved to the window, gazing down the cobbled street where Flaxborough continued its ordinary rhythm. Children played, shopkeepers arranged their displays, and townspeople passed with polite smiles and hidden concerns. Beneath this placid surface, he knew, subtle currents of intent and rivalry flowed, waiting only for the precise point at which they might be drawn into clarity. This understanding, he reflected, was the essence of investigation in a town like Flaxborough. Not the crude measurement of facts alone, but the patient mapping of human inclination, behavior, and the quiet, sometimes unconscious gestures that spoke more truth than overt evidence ever could. And as evening light softened the town, Purbright sat once more, calm and attentive, letting the network of subtle human signals assemble itself in his mind. He did not yet know the culprit, but he understood the landscape, the psychology, the motivations, the invisible architecture of civic life that would soon guide him to the answer. The following morning, Purbright set his plan into motion with his habitual calm. He knew that the person behind the incidents had a tendency toward careful observation and subtle provocation. To reveal them required a situation in which the individual might act naturally, without perceiving any pressure, yet exposing themselves through small, involuntary reactions. He chose St. Ethelred's once more as the venue. The church was quiet, occupied only by the necessary personnel, choirmaster, organist, and a few committee members attending to routine preparations. Purbright arranged a brief rehearsal of the vestry activities under the pretext of inventorying choir robes and hymnals. He ensured the corridor and radiator were visible from both ends, yet left enough distance to encourage independent movement. Mally stood discreetly nearby, taking mental notes but remaining unseen, while Purbright circulated politely among the participants, discussing trivial points about the schedule, robes, and the upcoming festival service. His tone was entirely casual, devoid of urgency, though the arrangement of objects and movement paths had been meticulously considered. He approached Mrs. Cramley with gentle questions about the inventory, asking her to confirm which robes required pressing and which had been recently laundered. She moved with careful attention, adjusting garments and speaking politely, her gloved hands hovering briefly over each surplice. Purbright noted the lavender scent she carried, faint yet perceptible, and filed it silently in his mind. Next, he called Mr. Chaffin over under the pretense of verifying the alignment of sheet music in the choir loft. Chaffin moved dutifully, yet faltered slightly when Purbright asked about the positioning of the organist's personal hymnals, glancing toward the loft and then the corridor without speaking. It was a trivial hesitation, but Purbright observed it with interest. Then Purbright positioned himself near the radiator corridor and engaged in light conversation with the choir boys, eliciting casual responses and inadvertently providing a reason for anyone watching to react. He mentioned in passing that certain hymnals had been misfiled, though he did so with a tone suggesting mere clerical curiosity rather than accusation. A few minutes passed with minor movement, then subtly the organist appeared at the corridor's entrance, ostensibly checking the robing room for missing items. Her eyes flicked toward the radiator, and she paused, a micro-expression that revealed more than words could. She adjusted a glove, bent slightly to lift a mislaid hymnal, and in that brief, unconscious motion touched the corridor where the lavender scent lingered. Purbright allowed the moment to unfold, observing the way she hesitated, then straightened abruptly, as though startled by her own awareness of being in the inspector's presence. He continued casual conversation about hymnals and rehearsal schedules, saying nothing about the scent, the scuff marks, or the previous incidents. Mally, watching from the side, whispered softly, "Did she?" "She's uncomfortable," Purbright replied evenly. "Notice how she overcompensates, adjusts the gloves, shifts weight. Her attention is divided between routine and something more, a preoccupation with being observed." The organist moved again, more deliberately now, to replace a robe on its hanger. As she did, her sleeve brushed faintly against the radiator, disturbing a small cluster of dust and fibers. The action was innocuous, yet to Purbright it confirmed a subtle pattern. She had handled objects in that area more frequently than her statement suggested, and the lavender scent she carried had transferred with casual inevitability. By the end of the session, Purbright had gathered enough to understand the scope of her movements and the unconscious signals betraying them. No confrontation had occurred, no accusations had been made, and yet the reaction, involuntary and consistent, had exposed her interaction with the corridor and its peculiar traces. Purbright stepped back, hands behind his back, letting the normal rhythm of the church resume. Choirboys chattered about minor tasks. Mrs. Cramley continued folding robes with precise care. Mr. Chaffin returned to organizing sheet music. The trap had succeeded quietly. The guilty party had revealed herself through natural response, her civility and caution unable to conceal what human instinct could not entirely restrain. Mally approached, eyes bright with tentative understanding. "You mean she gave herself away without knowing?" "Exactly," Purbright said, voice measured, almost casual. "Evidence of intention often manifests not in deliberate acts, but in the subtle alignment of attention and hesitation. One observes, one waits, and the truth, if handled carefully, reveals itself naturally." Outside, the town carried on, unaware that the quiet orchestration of an inspector's patience had already begun to unravel the web behind the midnight events. And within the still air of St. Ethelred's, the faint scent of lavender whispered a story only Purbright had fully understood. That evening, Purbright invited the key figures to the church hall under the pretext of a routine discussion about rehearsal schedules and inventory. The space smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, and the lighting, softened by shaded lamps, lent the gathering a calm formality. Canon Linstead arrived first, followed by Mr. Chaffin, Mrs. Cramley, the organist, and finally Edwin Loft with his mother. The arrangement was deliberate. Purbright allowed each participant to occupy a position where he could observe posture, glance and gesture with minimal interference. He began by recapitulating the events as he understood them, using neutral language, focusing on chronology rather than accusation. "Last week," he said, "a small package was observed in the vestry corridor, and shortly thereafter the processional cross vanished for a time." He paused, allowing the words to settle. Both incidents caused understandable concern, though no direct harm resulted. Edwin shifted in his seat, hands folded tightly, while the adults exchanged polite glances, each sensing the significance of the moment without yet understanding it. Purbright continued, calmly but with precise timing. "Mr. Dunn was present last night," he said, "and while his movements were flustered, they accounted for nothing missing or misplaced. Attention to detail can mislead when anxiety is involved." Mr. Dunn nodded, visibly relieved, adjusting his spectacles, and Canon Linstead murmured an approving word. Purbright then addressed Mrs. Cramley, remarking on the care with which she managed the robes and furnishings. She smiled tightly, acknowledging oversight without any admission. Finally, Purbright turned his attention to the organist. "You, of course, had access to both the vestry and the robing room. Your movements, precise as they are, intersected with spaces where objects were temporarily displaced. In your diligence to manage appearances, you may have overlooked a small, unintended consequence." The organist's face revealed the first hint of unease, though she remained composed. Purbright allowed silence to linger, then spoke again, gently. "The processional cross was placed in the pond, not out of malice nor for gain, but as a demonstration, an assertion of subtle control, if you will, over a sequence of
observations that could have gone unnoticed. Your intention was to create intrigue, to observe reactions." A flicker of recognition passed across her eyes, involuntary and brief. Purbright gestured toward Edwin. "And here is the boy who saw the initial package. Edwin, would you recount what you witnessed that night?" Edwin's voice was steady, clear and precise. "I saw someone bend down by the radiator. They had something wrapped, and they tucked it behind. Then they moved toward the back door. I didn't see their face, only the shape and their movements." The adults remained silent, the significance of the observation sinking in. Purbright leaned forward slightly. This small observation made by a child with remarkable attention aligns perfectly with the pattern of events. The person in question moved deliberately, yet left only faint traces, scuff marks, lavender scent, and a thread. Nothing overt, nothing violent, merely a subtle demonstration orchestrated to provoke curiosity and watch the town respond. The organist's composure faltered for the briefest moment, the faintest tightening of the jaw betraying acknowledgement. Purbright continued, serene and unhurried. All other actions, displacement of robes, adjustment of hymnals, minor distractions, were consistent with this orchestration. The observations of each adult, though well-intentioned, provided no direct evidence beyond the subtle traces left behind. A silence settled over the room, weighted yet calm. Canon Linstead cleared his throat, nodding faintly in understanding. Mr. Chaffin exhaled, a soft relief escaping him. Mrs. Cramley's rigid posture eased slightly, acknowledging that careful management had been appreciated. Purbright concluded gently, "Thus the mystery is not of theft, nor malice, nor negligence. It is a testament to the attentiveness of a child and the subtle interplay of human behavior. Curiosity, caution, and a desire for control within ordinary bounds. The truth rests in observation, patience, and the careful reading of small clues rather than dramatic evidence." Edwin smiled faintly, proud yet humble, as the adults absorbed the explanation. The sense of relief spread evenly, tempered by the awareness that Flaxborough had narrowly skirted chaos. Purbright allowed a final pause, observing the calm faces, the slight adjustments in posture, the muted acknowledgements of shared understanding. The town's intricate web of politeness and subtle rivalry had been navigated with patience, and the sequence of minor intrigues now lay fully revealed. No one had been blamed, yet all had learned the power of observation, the significance of small actions, and the quiet authority of a perceptive mind. The church, restored to order, seemed almost to exhale, the residual lavender scent now a benign memory of events past. In that calm, civil setting, the truth had emerged gently, naturally, and in accordance with the rhythms of Flaxborough
itself. By the following morning, the rhythm of Flaxborough had resumed, though with a subtle undercurrent of awareness that nothing in the town remained entirely unchanged. Shopkeepers arranged their wares with habitual care, the baker placed scones and loaves in neat rows, and the children of the square ran with laughter that no longer carried anxious glances toward the church. Yet beneath these ordinary motions a quiet lesson lingered. Even small disturbances could ripple through the routines of polite society. At St. Ethelred's, the robes were refolded, hymnals realigned, and the radiator corridor swept with meticulous attention. Mrs. Cramley oversaw each action with her customary precision, muttering occasional reminders about the correct placement of surplices. The organist, now visibly relieved, moved with understated efficiency, carrying out tasks without the furtive glances of recent days. Mr. Chaffin adjusted sheet music, ensuring the choir loft was orderly, his earlier apprehension replaced by mild satisfaction at the restoration of propriety. The sexton arrived to polish brass and refill candles, humming a tune that spoke of comfort in routine, while the faint scent of lavender persisted just enough to remind those present of the peculiar events of the previous week. Canon Linstead walked the nave with a measured pace, inspecting pews and lecterns, yet displaying neither irritation nor alarm, only the dignified calm of a man who had witnessed minor crises before and resolved them with quiet authority. In the High Street, townspeople conversed with careful discretion. The postmistress, Mrs. Snelling, commented politely on the weather, rather than lingering on scandal, while Mr. Beckett, the bookseller, observed the passage of pedestrians with a faint smile, noting the social equilibrium gradually reasserting itself. Even Mr. Creek, at the Green Man, adjusted his narrative to emphasize decorum rather than intrigue, remarking to patrons on the importance of vigilance in maintaining the town's character. Edwin Loft walked to school with a sense of quiet pride, though he spoke little of the events. His parents exchanged subdued glances with fellow citizens, acknowledging the boy's observant nature and the subtle authority of Inspector Purbright, whose patient guidance had resolved the mystery without assigning blame. The children's chatter in the streets carried a hint of mischief now freed from anxiety, their curiosity tempered by an understanding that the adult world remained watchful yet measured. At the police station, Sergeant Malley filed his reports, noting the return of the processional cross to its proper place and the absence of any lasting harm. Purbright, seated at his desk with hands neatly folded, reviewed notes and observations, ensuring the town's recent perturbations were fully recorded. He exhibited neither triumph nor haste. His satisfaction lay in the seamless resolution achieved through patient observation, polite questioning, and careful attention to human behavior. Conversations in the town returned to ordinary subjects, committee meetings, church schedules, and the small personal quarrels that defined local life. Yet the faint awareness of recent incidents persisted, informing interactions with a subtle wariness and a modestly heightened respect for procedure. Even minor grievances were now tempered by recognition of the town's capacity for attention and restraint. As evening approached, the sun cast long shadows across the cobbled streets, and Flaxborough settled into its habitual quietude. Shop windows glimmered with lantern light, church bells chimed a gentle cadence, and the faint scent of lavender, once a marker of intrigue, lingered only as a memory of the subtle choreography of observation and intention. Purbright, having concluded his daily rounds, returned to his office. He opened ledgers, recorded minor notes, and allowed himself a moment to appreciate the restored order. The town's routines had resumed, outwardly unchanged, yet the events of the week had left a quiet imprint on those who observed and those who acted. Politeness, vigilance, and the small mechanics of human nature had been carefully traced and understood. In the calm, dimly lit office, with papers stacked neatly and the soft ticking of a clock marking ordinary time, Inspector Purbright continued his work. Flaxborough had returned to its familiar rhythms, yet beneath the surface subtle awareness remained, a testament to the careful observation that had quietly guided the town back to equilibrium.